really family. There's one thing I could talk a long time about would be my father. To start with, he wasn't very big, and Roger resembled him more than any other member of the family. Only my father was a little larger. He weighed about 165, 70 pounds when he was normal, the time that he was most active. I might say we moved to Boise because President Woodrow Wilson appointed him collector of internal revenue for the whole state. I believe in those days that the IRS had a better reputation than they have today. It was a quiet honor and probably the highest, recognized as the highest federal job in the state at that time. Oh, I could talk to you a lot about him. I remember him, as I was just thinking there today, we had family reunions, and my father was always made the chairman of the family reunions, and we had many of them, and they were always not the Williams family, but the Morris family. That's my mother's family, and we always had quite a reunion. After he passed away, they just started to get less and less and less, and finally they petered out altogether. I imagine Chris and Scott and Dave would be interested in. My father was quite an athletic man, although he never participated in any big things. But in our little town of Samaria, when I was growing up, the town was about 380 to 400 people. Now I guess it's down to about one-tenth that many people. But on our ranch, we always had a racehorse. And every time anybody would come to town and we'd have celebration, we'd always have a horse to race, and we'd race anybody, and he'd race anybody. And I might say most of the time we won. Another thing he used to do when I was a kid, I was telling Milt, is that he had pulling horses. And the people would come, and the farmers would come, and they'd hook these horses up single tree to single tree, if you know what that is. That is their backs to back, and then put the single tree between, and then they'd start, and the horse that could pull the other horse was the best puller. That's all it amounted to. A horse didn't have to be big to win this. He just had to be able to get the first jump. And that, if he got that, of course, he could pull even a much bigger horse than what he was. He seemed to have always had a pretty well-trained horse, because on this event, we most always won. Another thing they used to do, I remember, is we'd have celebrations in our little town. We had the town square on this, and they'd have foot races, and he'd run anybody. They'd come and they'd run hand in hand for about 20 yards, and then they'd take off and run. I don't remember him winning all of the races, but he was always competitive and did this. And you might understand at this time he was quite old, that is, for a track person, because I was 8, 10, 12 years old at that time. So he wasn't a young man, but he'd always do this. Another thing, when I was young, there was a great deal of talk about polygamy, and the church doing it and having polygamy wives and all of this. And my aunts always used to stay to my place occasionally. My Aunt Sophia lived with us and helped my mother on the ranch when there was harvest time. We used to have as many as 20 or 25 men, and they had very primitive ways that way to prepare for it. We used to cut up sagebrush for fuel to cook with on our dry farm. But he'd always tell the salesman, we had the store in our little town, and of course the peddlers always come around. We always called them peddlers. And he'd always tell them that, and then they'd scatter that tale all up and down the valley that Lou Williams had 2 or 3 wives. Of course, he never did. There's no history of ever any polygamy in our family, ever, as far as I know. But he had that tale and this. But in those same periods of time, there was a lot of traveling ministers that used to travel around and debate the Mormons on religion and mostly on polygamy. And in our little town, he was always the man that they chose to debate this fellows. They'd come, and they'd always had a big crowd in Samaria, maybe as many as 200 people would come, and there's only that would fill our little church right up to the full, and he'd always debate them. And yet, and I could say that as far as I'm concerned, in talking in the church, and I don't want to talk too much religion, that he was probably the best talker, in my opinion, I have ever heard in church. When he was speaking was be about the only time that I really didn't care if I had to go to church. Most of the time when we went to church, we had a neighbor right across from the church, and he had a great big barn and used to feed quite a bit of cattle. And most of the time we'd skip out of church, go over and ride the calves while church was on, but we got credits for that. But when my dad was going to speak, and I might say that was quite often, I always went to church. I had a good deal of trouble, maybe some of you know this, but in my early age I couldn't hardly talk. In fact, I didn't talk, and I used to sit in the back of the church and hope someday that I could stand up before an audience and make a speech. That was my one and biggest desire. I might say that he always liked to take his kids along, and I believe because of my handicap, I think I got more than my share of trips. Sometimes I even got to go to Logan, once in a while even to Salt Lake when the times were right. I remember one time we went to Salt Lake along with Professor Powell. Professor Powell was the music teacher in Malad, and I think largely to improve my speaking voice and to learn to talk, I took a lot of music lessons from the very time that I could ride a horse until we moved from down there. I took lessons, which would be for a period of about 12 years, I imagine, or 13 years. I studied voice, and I had the privilege of singing a lot. I could sing, but I couldn't talk, so I got this, and I used to sing in all the political rallies, both parties sometimes. And to the mutual conjoints, they used to have conjoints in the church, and every Tuesday night, once a month, they'd have a program, and I was always on that. The Welsh people are great people to sing, and we used to have contests, and I used to go to Malad and represent Samaria in the contests of singing, and once in a while I'd win, but not too often. I was in those things. I was probably the youngest person. Now, I'm talking about me, but my dad was responsible for all this and talking. I don't know how much money and time that they spent on me teaching me to talk before I could be just partly normal. I had a problem on this. We moved to Pocatello. We lived in Pocatello about a year and a half. During that time, they had a couple of doctors in there who were supposed to be experts in throats. So my dad arranged for me to have an operation. So I went to the hospital. I had my adenoids removed, I had my tonsils removed, and I had some veins fixed up in my nose, and I had some veins fixed down in my throat, in addition to all of this. And that was during the war, and there wasn't many automobiles. So he arranged, the only kind of a car we had was T-models at that time, and he arranged for a taxi to be out in front of the hospital in Pocatello, so the minute the operation was over, he could take me back home. Hospitals were all quite full, and if you could come in and go out, they appreciated that. Well, I had the operation. They put me in the room to partly come to after the anesthetic, and I didn't come out from under it. Mother went home for a while. We had a large family, and then she come back and she came in my room and she called the nurse and said, "Look, he's turning black." And the nurse says, "Well, he'll be all right. That's just part of the operation." And she stood there a little while, and then she wasn't satisfied, so she went and she got the doctor. And the doctor come in there, and I had swallowed my tongue. and bled inwardly. So they put me on a deal like an ironing board at about 90 degrees or 80 degrees angle with my head down, and so that the blood would come back down to. And then they injected, if I can say, I guess about 4 or 5 pounds of coffee grinds into me, and that was the stimulator. So I was passing coffee for a long time. But when to this day. But when I come to, and that was about 48 hours afterwards, I had 12 instruments sticking out of my mouth, each one of them holding a vein together so I wouldn't bleed. And they took them out one at a time over quite a period of time. And the only thing I could eat was a milkshake, and they could cut a straw down, and they didn't give intravenous feedings, I guess, in those days, but I could get a milkshake down. So I had those for a long time. But that's a little incident that I don't know if that's about my father or not, but it's something. Well, I think I could talk about my father. He was very interested in education. That's another reason why he wanted to move to Boise. He wanted his kids to all go to college. He wanted them all to go first to a good high school. And he didn't think much of the high school in Malad, so he wanted to go to a bigger town. That's one reason we moved to Pocatello, and then from Pocatello on to Boise. That's quite a long time.
Tell us about some of these Indian things.
Well, yeah, our ranch in Smerry, as you might realize, you folks, that it's not too far from Washakie. And when I was a kid, that was quite an Indian village up there. They had the tents, everything up with their triangles. And our store seemed to be their main store that they would trade in. They'd come up there. And I would say about the Indians in those days, you have to be right there, because if you didn't, they'd steal everything that was loose. If they'd ask you for a match, in those days they had those old-fashioned match boxes, they'd reach in and take all they could get with their hands and this kind of stuff. So they were kind of tricky. But one thing they did do, my dad used to make trades with them. And I remember Lou and I, that's my brother, laying out our hands, and they would trace all around them, and the next trip they would come in, they'd bring us a pair of buckskin gloves with beads and everything all on it, and we used to trade on them. But my father was quite a favorite of the Indians in that country. Father was very kind-hearted. During my time as a very young boy, they opened up Pocatello Valley. Now, Pocatello Valley is right over the hills west from Malad. It's not by Pocatello. It was named after Chief Pocatello, and that country was all opened up to dry farming. And our store was the main store, and he trusted everybody. People going out there were quite poor, and some of them paid, but about 90% of them never did pay him. Even after I moved to Boise, I threw away a stack of bills, those little shop tickets, about 8 inches high, solid, just with money that people owed us, that he would never try to collect. Most of the farmers out there in those days, just like it is today, the first farmer onto a farm, a new farmer, hardly ever makes it. The second one hardly ever makes it, but they make it possible for the third one to make it, and that's about the average of when you take on new territory and new farms in those days. And after we moved to Boise, which was 25 years afterwards, I threw away hundreds and hundreds of dollars worth of bills. Of course, $100 in those days is about the same as $1,000 or much more than $1,000 at the time I threw it away. So I could tell you that. He traveled a lot to the Indians. Once in a while, I went with him on home missions on Sunday. He'd speak to them, and down at Washakie even for the church, and that. And he was quite a favorite. Anything else? Huh?
How many brothers and sisters did you have?
I had the same number as I have. I had 3 sisters and 3 brothers.
Your father?
My father is the youngest of 10 children, and this was quite an influence on his life, because my father was the same age as his nieces and nephews in Samaria, so he grew up with his nieces and nephews. His oldest brother, Uncle Jerry, lived right next door, but he was a lot older than my father, and he was the youngest of 10. He was born in 1874 and died when he was 69 years old.
You know what I think his favorite thing was?
What?
Nothing's too good for my kids.
Yeah, he did everything for his kids, everything, and he'd go without many things to anything for his kids.
It sounds like our dad.
No.
Nothing was ever too good for his kids.
Anything else you want to hear?
Was he a politician, and what about the township planner?
Well, at the time, yes, he was one of the first workers of the Townsend Plan. Now, I think many of you don't know what the Townsend Plan was, but the Townsend Plan was for the old people to create a pension of $200 at that time, and it would have been a marvelous thing if that would have gone through. The old people at a certain age, up to that amount. And he was the originator of that, traveled all over the state of Idaho. That was one of the jobs. If you're ever in Boise, you see out in front of the State House the statue of Governor Studenberg, and he was the one responsible for that. He raised every dime for that. He wasn't the chairman. The governor took credit for it, but it was my father who created and that money. At that time, I told him that I thought it would have been a lot better if they'd taken that money, which was about $60,000. At that time, to build that statue, they had built a library, and he kind of partly agreed with me. He said, the powers to be wants the statue of Studenberg. Studenberg was murdered by Harry Orchard, one of our famous murderers, I guess, in Idaho, and spent many years in the penitentiary, and I got to know him very well. He made me a pair of shoes once, and he used to raise turkeys at the penitentiary, and we always got a turkey for Christmas from the penitentiary, Idaho Penitentiary. Any other questions, huh?
Was he a Democrat?
My father was the Democrat. He was usually the county chairman of Oneida County. He ran for office several times. At that time, he ran for office Franklin County, and all of Franklin County, part of Caribou, and part of Power was in Oneida County. He always got a big majority in what is now Oneida County, but usually he got beat in Franklin County, which is now Franklin County, and those faraway counties. He did run for county assessor and was elected by a tremendous vote. The time he ran the second time, Oneida County was the same size as it is today. And he did, but he was always interested in politics. He went to many national conventions and always represented the Democrats in that county. At one time, in the early days, we had the Du Bois fights. Maybe you've heard of those in Idaho. Political fights, mostly anti-Mormon fights, up through, all the way from Bear Lake up through Blackfoot, St. Anthony. It was quite a deal. Du Bois was from Blackfoot in that territory. At one time, he was going to the convention at Twin Falls, to the Democratic convention, and he was literally thrown off of the train because they wanted no Mormons, one wife was the idea. At that time, of course, we never had polygamy, but he was thrown off the train anyway. They didn't want any Mormons that believed in polygamy or anything at this convention. So he was literally thrown off at the train going into Twin Falls, the Democratic convention.
Did he have any hobbies?
His hobbies was his kids, I would say. He loved flowers. He used to take them to office all the time and raise them, particularly gladiolus, and he loved roses. He just liked to do things for other people. That's his main job. He had quite a time. He was a very severe diabetic, as you might realize. I developed some of his genes, but at those days he didn't take care of it even as well as I do, which isn't very good.
Was he diabetes also? Did he have diabetes also, or was that later?
He had it a good deal of his life.
But not as a child?
No, not as a child, no. Only died at 69, and of course the diabetic brought on one thing. He died with that. He had dropsy, developed this. He got so that several things. He died with heart trouble, which was the cause the doctors gave, but it was created from diabetic and dropsy and one thing, and then he died in Boise. Roger and Bruce was quite young. I remember them going to the hospital in their Boy Scout uniforms to see him one time. I don't know if they remember anything about that at all, but he did remember Roger and Bruce very much. And Neil went to see him, and Linda saw him. I don't know about Jolene. Ever seen him?
I remember him, but I don't remember him in the hospital.
Well, he was in the hospital. We paid for the West Wing of St. Alphonsus Hospital. My father was never rich. We were rich among the poor, you might say. Everybody was poor, but I don't think we realized it much in Smeria. We had our ranch in Smeria. We had the store. We had our ranch in Big Holler. He homesteaded 360 acres up there. Then we had a ranch in Pleasant View, which we farmed. The ranch in Pleasant View belonged to my grandfather. On his death, their brothers and sisters came in and just divided up, and it was gone and took it away. It was kind of an unhappy time. My grandfather lived with us his last 20 years of his life in Smeria, and a good deal of that he suffered from a stroke and was very miserable to be with or work. Up until that time, he was a very wonderful man. He worked, like I've said, he worked on the Salt Lake Temple 20 years. He worked on the Logan Temple for 10 years. He was the chief stonemason in the Logan Temple, my grandfather. But when he passed away, my uncles and aunts came in our house and stripped it of everything that they thought belonged to him, even though a good deal of it belonged to my dad and my mother. My mother never made a squawk about it. They just let them take it, which was the easy thing to do, I think, in that day, even though I wouldn't do it, but she did. And I'm hoping that I don't have that problem in my family. And I could say that we recently made a very strong will, I'd say, and it's been filed. And in all fairness, Milt has got to sign the papers, and I've made Milt the executor of this because he is the youngest and he's home and be there. And I hope that's satisfactory. I had to name somebody, and he seems to have a better knack of handling money than me or maybe some other members of the family. So, but I'm sure the way it's written up, there'll be no problems whatever. There won't be that much to quarrel about. I think your mother and I will next year, when we get paid for our home, we had a balloon payment, and that's due in October '86, and we will divide that money among the family. What that isn't much, but
If you don't move to a new place.
even if we do move to a new place, that won't have no bearing on it, because we still got the home we got to help on the other one.
You better save some of your money when you get old.
Well,
Better caddy to carry your clubs around.
at 82, I am now 9 years on borrowed time. 72 is the average age. And you take somebody with high blood pressure and diabetes, drops that down to about 60. So I've already had 21 years. I'm not. But, yeah. Well, I feel all right, and the reason I started to play golf, which I don't do too well yet, but I enjoy it. And most of all, I like to play with my kids, my grandkids and my own kids. I enjoy it. I I get a big thrill out of being with my family. I like to see them. I like to turn on the TV in the morning and watch Walt sing in choir. I get a big kick out of that, and I brag about it to my folks. I like to, if I'm in a land board meeting, which I am very often, and I look out and see Milt out in the audience, I'm proud to see him there. Anything that they do, I'm just proud to. That's true for all of them, everybody in my family. I enjoy them. And I hope someday that when people ask my family or any member of my family what they thought of the father or what kind of a man he actually was, I get some high marks. I don't know. And it's kind of hard to say. That was that. Talked about a bit.
That's kind of...
But you never had to be ashamed of your...
Oh, yes, I hear you. Very plain.
All right. Where were you born at?
I was born in Samaria, Idaho, in Oneida County,
What year?
April the 14th, 1904, at 8:50 in the afternoon.
Okay. How many brothers and sisters did you have?
I had 7 brothers and sisters.
Okay. What did your dad do
My dad was
for a living?
a farmer, a merchant, and he also served as county assessor in Oneida County.
Joe, what was your mother's maiden name?
My mother's maiden name was Sarah Morris, M-O-R-I-S-E.
Where was she born?
She was born in Samaria.
Wow, okay. And her father's name?
Was William E. Morris, and he was born in Wales.
Okay. Do you have any fond memories of your mother?
Oh, I have many fond memories of my mother. She was alive until I was well out of high school.
What's the most or the best memory you have of your mother? Say one of the happiest memories.
Oh, I imagine some of the happy members was probably here in Boise. My father was appointed the first revenue collector for the state of Idaho, and we moved to Boise in 1919. And I think for a period along that time was probably the happiest time we'd had.
Okay.
We never had any real bad times out of the ordinary. I don't think we had a lot of bad luck in Samaria in our farming and economic conditions, but I think the happiest time was while my father was serving as Internal Revenue Collector.
How old was he when he passed away?
He was 69.
And he was doing what? Was he retired when he passed away?
Well, yes, he was retired. He hadn't worked for some time.
What did he die of?
Well, he died of, he created a bad cough which brought on a heart condition. A heart condition brought on a disease called dropsy at that time, and he got so bad that he wouldn't react to any medication.
Okay. Do you remember when you were baptized, for example?
Yes, I can remember the time. I can't hardly remember the date, but I can remember the occasion very plain. I was baptized in a spring ditch, the big ditch we call it, going out of Samaria down into Samaria Lake on about my birthday in April, and at that time the water was very, very cold.
Okay. Who baptized you? Do you remember?
No, I don't recall.
Okay, how about who confirmed you at church?
My father confirmed me.
Okay. You still go down to Samaria?
Yes, occasionally. I try to get there once a year at least.
Let's see, you said your mother was born where?
In Samaria.
Okay, so both, well, how about your dad? Where
He was born in Samaria, too.
So they were both born in Samaria?
Yes.
Okay. Well, you went to grade school in Samaria?
Yes, I went through the 6th grade in Samaria.
Okay, and then where did you go, junior high
And
or?
then I went to Pocatello for the 7th grade and the 8th grade at Lone School in Boise. And there into high school.
And then what happened after high school? Where'd you go to school?
Well, I went to school at the University of Idaho. I didn't quite graduate, but I attended school a long time. During my stay at the University of Idaho, I worked for the Dean of Agriculture in his office to raise money for my schooling.
When you were going to high school, Joe, did you play athletics?
Yes, I was exposed to it a little bit.
Like what? Did you play basketball?
Well, I played 4 years for Boise High School and had the privilege of playing in the state championship team and
Basketball?
and we played at the national tournament in Chicago.
How about other sports?
Well, I played 2 years on the football team, and I was a scrub for a year before that. We also enjoyed the privilege of being state champions during that time.
Did you play baseball?
Yes, I played 1 season of baseball, but I was kicked off of the baseball team because the coaches wanted me to go out for track, so I didn't participate on the track team. We also won the state championship in track that year. I was no big help to it, but I was on the team.
What do you remember, say, as probably the most exciting thing in your high school career?
Well, I believe the most exciting thing in my high school year was to attend the National Basketball Tournament in Chicago in 1924. It so happened to be in the month of April of that year we played there.
Do you have any fond memories of coaches in high school or teachers?
Well, I have 2 very fine coaches. One was named Jim Kane. He was from the University of Idaho, and he was a very fine coach. In my last 2 years, my coach was from Ohio, was from Nebraska wrestling, and I had him for 2 years, and he was a super coach. A very fine man and a good friend.
Did you do any playing of musical instruments in the band, or did you sing in the...
No, I didn't play any instruments, but all 4 years I was in the high school operetta and sang parts in the school at that time.
Did you sing the leads?
No, I didn't. Wasn't fortunate to have a lead. I had a small parts, one small solo in one of them, but I was not one of the leading characters.
When did you graduate from high school?
Yeah, I graduated in 1924.
Did they have seminary in those days?
No, I never attended seminary.
Okay, and then right after that, did you have to go in the Army, or?
No, I was too young for World War I and too old for World War II, even though I'd had the ROTC in Boise High School and the University of Idaho. They wouldn't take me into the Army on account of my age.
Did you have any summer jobs, say between graduation of high school?
Yes, I worked every summer in my life, I guess, when I was old enough to do it. One of my jobs where I feel I made the most money was picking potatoes. We worked in crews, and we got 8 cents a sack for picking them, and then we divided it among 8 people.
Where did you work the potato business?
It was out of Caldwell, out by Melba.
Okay, and then you graduated from high school, and that summer you worked, and did you go right on up to the University of Idaho?
I went up to the University of Idaho in the at Christmas time with my brother Lou. And I went to school with him. I was at the university approximately a month and a half before I entered school. At that time, I worked full time and generated a little money.
What did you take as a major in college?
Well, I took accounting first, but I actually wanted to be a coach when I attended the University of Idaho. I'd been very active through high school, and I liked that, but my size, I guess my speed somewhat, did not grant me the privilege of making the University of Idaho teams.
What kind of positions have you had in the church?
Well, I guess like all growing up in the church, I was been president of all the quorums, including a group president of the high priest quorum. I guess my main job in the church was in the priesthood activity program, which I was appointed by the first council, and I served in that capacity for 27 years.
That was the regional representative?
The regional representative for southern Idaho and eastern Oregon and a small part of northern Utah.
In athletics?
In athletics, yes.
And how many people tried to kill you while you were... Were you ever in a bishopric?
No, I never served in the bishopric, only as ward clerk. I served as ward clerk.
Did you go on a mission?
No, I never attended a mission for some reason. I do not know why.
Okay. Did you work in any stake position?
Yes, I worked in the state MIA for many years. I was what they called at that time, my last job was M-man supervisor for the Boise State. At that time, Boise State comprised the territory from Grands Ferry over to Nessa, Oregon, and Louisa.
When did you meet Lorraine Gillenskog?
Oh, I met Lorraine Gillenskog in Boise in about 1926 or 7. She was here visiting her sister, Glenda.
What did you do, take her out on a date?
Yes, at that time I was taking Glenda out, and somehow or another we got switched up to Lorraine. And we went together for about 5 years.
And then 5 years, and then you got married?
And then we got married.
Where'd you get married at?
Got married in the Salt Lake Temple.
Okay. What year was that? Do you remember?
1930.
Okay. And she was living where?
She was living with her sister in Boise at the time that I met her.
And she had been living with her parents in
Smithfield, Utah.
Ah, yeah. Okay. Well, what are some of the, let's say after you got out of college, what did you do for an occupation?
Well, I had several occupations, it seemed like to me. At that time it was rather rough, as you know, it's coming up towards the 1930 Depression, 29 and 30. And
what job did you have during the Depression?
Well, I ran service stations during the Depression. I had a station located on 10th and Bannock, on 12th and Main, 11th and Grove. My last station was down on Capitol Boulevard in Boise.
I heard you had an incident where you almost got burned to death with a fire. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I had a fire. My contract with the Associated Oil Company was I paid for my gas from the readings on the gas pumps. And only paid for the number of gallons I sold. They delivered gas, and it made no difference to me how much they brought. It had no bearing on my expenses. One time they brought in a load in the morning early. The truck driver was very inattentive, and the gas ran over onto my garage floor to about 1 inch thick on the floor. I noticed it, and I yelled at him, and I ran in and picked up a broom to sweep the broom into the substance we had in the garage. During that time, the gas exploded. I was standing in it, about an inch thick. Of course, it burnt me very, very bad. I will say at this time, of course, I'd been through the temple. I'd worn my garments. Any place my garment touched me, I was not burnt. But every place else was burnt very, very bad.
You feel like that was a real miracle in your life?
Yes, I think that had a bearing, and I believe that our garments is a protection to us, and that's a good testimony to me of that fact.
Where did that accident happen?
It happened in the service station down on Capitol Boulevard here in Boise.
I heard a story about you involving a barrel of peanut butter.
Oh, that was when I was a youngster in Pocatello. I worked for the freight yard at that time. As you can realize, during that time there was a great shortage of labor on account of the war. And us young guys could find a job. And I was trucking a 54-gallon barrel of peanut butter, pulling it in back of me. I had a small rock that threw the truck off. It fell down on top of me, and the top come off of the peanut butter, and I had 50 gallons of peanut butter all over me.
Do you like peanut butter today, Joe?
I don't care much for peanut butter. I can eat it, but it's not one of my cherished dishes.
Okay, so you went on to marry Lorraine Gillenskog, and you moved back where? After you got married in the temple, you moved back to Boise?
Oh, I never left Boise.
Okay, so you just went down to Salt Lake?
Yeah, we got down to Salt Lake and got married, yes.
Okay. And you came back up here and were running service stations?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
When did you first get... Let's see, you worked for the YMCA with J.V. Caproot for a while, didn't you?
Yes, I worked for Caproot for a while. It was a very pleasant experience working with him. And I went down to balance the books one time. I was having trouble. And we got the books all straightened out, and they asked me to stay and do some part-time work, and I was there 5 years.
Was that just before you started into the State Auditor political scene?
Yes, that was just before. In fact, I resigned from the YMCA, my part-time job, to take the auditor's job.
And that was your first session as an elected official?
That's my first session as an elected official. I took the job. I was elected in 1958. I took the office the 1st of January, 1959.
And today is October 29th, 1988, and you're still in the office of State Auditor.
I'm still in the office. It's 30 years. I might say that's the longest that anybody has ever held a job, a political job, in the elected political job in the state of Idaho by far. I am the oldest sitting state auditor in active service in America today, both in age and in service.
Well, I think that's really notable, and that's exciting to hear about. Tell me, during your tenure as a state auditor, you've always been a Democrat, right?
Yes, I've always been a Democrat. I'm still a Democrat.
And how was it you were in Republican administrations as a Democrat?
Well, you know, my job shouldn't be too much political. I've tried to do the best job I can. There's no partiality. It's never been played as a political office. In fact, I don't even know the political choice of almost all of my employees. And we've never considered that. I think I've been well supported by the Republican Party. In fact, I know I have more than any other Democrat in history.
Well, that's really, that's exciting to hear that, because that shows what kind of a man you are. What positions nationally have you held while being the state auditor?
Well, I've held many positions. In fact, probably more than anybody from Idaho or any place else. I've practically held every position in the organization, both as national state administrator for Social Security for the state of Idaho. I've been president and all of the offices leading up to it. In the office of State Auditor, I was the elected national president and served as president for that office in 1972. I was the first Westerner ever elected to that office. Of course, in order to be elected state national president of that time, you had to run through the chairs from state treasurer up to 4 vice presidents, and then you were elected president. After my first campaign for national treasurer, I never had opposite position for another national job, which is unusual.
I remember an incident where you went up with the land board to a lake in northern Idaho and the boat capsized. Can you tell us a little bit about that incident?
Well, this was a very close incident for me. I about lost my life. We were on a boat, a long boat, about 16 feet, 18 feet long. It was late in the fall, and we were fishing for Mackinac deep in the water. The wind started to blow real hard, and the driver of the boat, he backed up into the waves. And of course it filled the boat, and it capsized and turned over and sank. On the front end of this boat was cover, where we kept our life jackets and things. When it started to go, I ran in there and threw out the life jackets. I never got one myself, but I threw them out to the other people. The boat turned over and went down, and I was caught in the air pocket of this boat. Stuck above the water about maybe 2 or 3 feet. I drove down, and I come back up, and I broke my glasses. In fact, I lost them, and I had a little trouble. But while I was still up in this pocket where I had air, I made up my mind I would dive down and try again. It's been very hard for me to open my eyes when I'm swimming. But I did. I went down, and when I found a little light, I come up, and it was on the outside of the boat, and hung on to that until we had a rescue come from across the lake.
Well, you must have an angel watching over you.
Yeah.
You just were honored by the seatbelt people, the state of Idaho, for another incident. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, I can tell you, we were on a trip to South Idaho to do some state business, and myself, Lorraine, and my son Roger, and somewhere about 12 miles west of Rupert, our car got out of control. Roger was driving, and the car rolled about 4 times and landed upside down. Roger and Lorraine was both able to get out, but I was under the car after the spillover. And we had quite a long time getting me out.
Did you both have your seatbelts connected?
We was fortunate to have seatbelts on, and I think that's the one thing that saved our life. For me, it was kind of a miracle because I wasn't much of a seatbelt wearer up until that time.
How many children have you had, Joe?
We've had 8 children. We lost 1 baby.
What was his name?
His name was Gregory.
What was he? Who was the first child?
The first child is Roger.
Okay. The second child?
Is Bruce.
And when did Gregory come on the scene?
Well, he was the next to the last one. Kristen is our youngest daughter. Gregory would have been older than her.
If you were going to recap this interview with saying what you feel like some of your greatest achievements in life have been, what comes to mind?
Well, I think my greatest achievement in my life is my family. I'm real proud of them. Some of them are not overloaded with financial success, but we're all very good people, good citizens, and they're pleasant to be around, and I think that's one of my greatest achievements, raising my family.
How about in your career? What would you say would be the greatest
Of course, in my career as businessman, being elected state auditor and continuing to be elected, I feel, is quite an achievement because it's very unusual for a Mormon and a Democrat to be elected in Idaho.
Okay, well, thank you, Joseph Rulon Williams, for this interview on Sunday, October 29th, 1988. Signing off, this is Walt Root.